Good morning, and today we're going to look at Patrick Henry's speech to the Virginia Convention, specifically some rhetorical and persuasive strategies that he implied. But first, a bit of the history. Why would he give such a speech? Well, let's take a look at England's acts. The first major opposition to British policy came in 1765 after the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act. Now, many colonists called for a boycott of British goods and some organized attacks on the custom houses and homes of tax collectors. They didn't like that everything all of a sudden became more expensive simply because their native country said so. So when the British Parliament votes to repeal the Stamp Act in March of 1765, they unfortunately a few years later come back with yet more taxation. In 1773 came the Tea Act, which granted the East India Company a monopoly on the American tea trade. So this was viewed by Americans as another example of taxation without representation, and militant patriots in Massachusetts organized the Boston Tea Party. Now, British tea, valued at 10,000 pounds at the time, was dumped into the Boston harbor. Britain, outraged, enacted the Coercive Acts, otherwise known in America as the Intolerable Acts, that closed Boston, Massachusetts to merchant shipping. It established British rule in Massachusetts. It made British officials immune to criminal prosecution in America and required colonists to quarter British troops when necessary. So shortly after that, Parliament has decided now that the colonists are getting a bit too rowdy. So in March of 24th of 1765, the British Parliament is going to pass the Quartering Act, and then the day later they're going to pass the Boston Port Act. Now, when we take a look only 3 days later, they also then adopt the Coercive Acts. They're pretty sure already in 1774 that there's going to be some problems or concerns, at least in the Massachusetts colony. Now, 1 year later, March 23rd, 1775, Virginian Patrick Henry voices American opposition to the British policy. Now, at the time he's voicing the opposition, most of the concerns for the British Parliament were happening in the Massachusetts colony. That's extremely far away from the Virginian colony, so most Virginians in their own parliaments, in their own house, are going to be not as concerned. This doesn't deal with Virginia, it deals with Massachusetts. Patrick Henry is not going to see it that way. He's going to see Americans in need, and he's going to voice his opinion. Now, to avoid interference from Lieutenant Governor Dunmore and his Royal Marines, the Second Virginia Convention met on March 20th, 1775 in Richmond, instead of the capital of Williamsburg, Virginia. A delegate to this conference, Patrick Henry, introduced a resolution to the Virginia Convention to form the local militia to be prepared to fight for the British. Now, Henry's opponents urged caution and patience until the Crown replied to Congress's latest petition for reconciliation. The resolution actually passed, but it did pass by only 5 votes. Now, when we read Henry's speech, one must consider the following key pieces. First of all, the speaker. What is Patrick Henry's background like when it comes to speaking in front of a place like the Virginia Convention? The occasion. We are meeting at the Virginia Convention before we declared independence, and most people have decided to wait for their petition on reconciliation. The audience. We have the delegates of the Virginia Convention, some people just as fiery as Patrick Henry, most wanting to wait it out. The purpose. We need to encourage other Virginians to take up arms to fight the British. The subject is to fight, and the tone is very urgent, pleading, and inflammatory. After all, even though some of these bad things have happened to the Massachusetts colony, it hasn't exactly happened in Virginia, and so some people consider this to be a Massachusetts problem. It's more urgent to people like Patrick Henry. If it happens there, it can happen here. So the most important consideration here is the audience. We have to consider who Patrick Henry is addressing. So now we're going to look a bit at his persuasive techniques. Now, persuasion is a form of discourse, usually speaking, that uses reason and emotional appeals to convince another person to act or think in a certain way. Now, rhetorical devices are structures within language that appeal to the readers or listeners, and they communicate certain types of ideas. Types of devices you might find might be a rhetorical question, which is a question to which no answer is expected. You kind of expect when you're giving the speech what the answer already is. The antithesis, otherwise known as the either-or fallacy. It expresses contrasting ideas and parallel grammatical structures. You might use repetition, the recurrence of words, phrases, or lines. You might also use parallelism. It's kind of like repetition, in which words or phrases of the same grammatical form connect ideas. And of course, from the time period that they're in, Patrick Henry is also going to use biblical allusions, which are references to events, figures, or phrases from the Bible. In this selection, his audience is going to have the rhetorical appeal because they all have the same shared belief. So when we take a look at the speech itself, we do see a lot of rhetorical devices being used. So we start off with Mr. President, no man thinks more highly than I do of patriotism, as well as abilities of the very worthy gentleman who have just addressed the House. Why would he begin the speech this way? Well, it could be regarded that perhaps he's conceding to the opposing view that patriotism is important. He's also showing respect for those who hold the opposing view to his, so this might be a bit of flattery. But as we continue on, he reads, "But different men often see the same subject in different lights. And therefore I hope it will not be thought disrespectful to those gentlemen, if entertaining as I do, opinions of a character very opposite to theirs. I shall speak forth my sentiments freely and without reserve." So with the parallel we have here with the different men and different lights, it could be a refutation to the opposing side, who may say that those who are not patriots would fight the British. As we continue on, Patrick Henry writes, "There is no time for ceremony. The question before the House is one of awful moment to this country. For my own part, I consider it as nothing less than a question of freedom or slavery, and in proportion to the magnitude of the subject ought to be the freedom of the debate. It is only in this way that we can hope to arrive at truth, and fulfill the great responsibility which we hold to God and our country. Should I keep back my opinions at such a time, through fear of giving offense, I should consider myself as guilty of treason towards my country, and an act of disloyalty towards the majesty of heaven, which I revere above all earthly kings." So when we look at it as nothing less than a question of freedom or slavery, Henry's referring to the need to fight for freedom. But because he says the question of freedom or the question of slavery, that either or fallacy is here, that is creating that pathos. He's trying to convince his listeners that there's only one alternative to fighting, and that would be their own slavery. As he continues on, that he says he hopes to arrive at the truth and fulfill the great responsibility which we hold to God and our country, he's creating an appeal to authority or ethos. He's calling on God's truth to fight for their freedom. He aligns God on the side of the colonists fighting for their freedom. Now, by juxtaposing God as the majesty of heaven at the end and the king for King George, he creates an appeal of authority, placing God above the king in his words, "The majesty of heaven, which I revere above all earthly kings." Now, God has a greatness of character. The king only has a position of authority. Patrick Henry continues, "Mr. President, it is natural to man to indulge in the illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth, and listen to the song of that siren till she transforms us into beasts. Is this the part of wise men, engaged in a great and arduous struggle for liberty? Are we disposed to be of the number of those who having eyes see not, and having ears hear not, the things which so nearly concern their temporal salvation? For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it may cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it. Now, when he's saying it is natural to indulge in the illusions of hope, he's saying that this is a concession to the opposition. This is a refutation and arguments against their side. Again, as we recall, most of the people in the Virginia Convention are waiting for their petition of reconciliation. They're hoping that they and the British Parliament can just let this pass. But Henry refutes by saying that freedom without fighting is only an illusion. It can't be a reality. Now, we also have a couple of important lines, a couple of allusions here of the idea of that siren till she transforms us into beasts. That's a mythical allusion about the witch goddess Circe transforming Odysseus' men to beasts in the Odyssey by Homer. But we also have a biblical allusion to Ezekiel 12:2 and a bit of parallelism when he talks about those who having eyes see not and having ears hear not. So Henry must be metaphorically comparing how the British are saying things to colonists which are false hopes, as to how Circe transformed the men into swine after charming them with her singing. And these important lines are both an appeal to authority and appeal to logic. Patrick Henry continues, I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know of no way of judging of the future but by the past. And judging by the past, I wish to know what there has been in the conduct of the British ministry for the last 10 years, to justify those hopes with which gentlemen have been pleased to solace themselves in the House. Is it that insidious smile with which our petition has been lately received? Trust it not, sir. It will prove a snare to your feet. Suffer not yourselves to be betrayed with a kiss. Ask yourselves how this gracious reception of our petition comports with these warlike preparations which cover our waters and darken our land. Are fleets and armies necessary to a work of love and reconciliation? Have we shown ourselves so unwilling to be reconciled that force must be called in to win back our love? Let us not deceive ourselves, sir. These are the implements of war and subjugation, the last arguments to which kings resort. Now, back at the very top, Henry uses a metaphor of the lamp, which is a biblical allusion saying that God's word, which is truth to them, is a lamp unto thy feet and a light unto thy path. As he states, I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. Next, we have an appeal to authority and appeal to ethos with, I know of no way of judging the future but by the past, because it shows him as a spiritual person. And so when he has this appeal to logos or logic, when Henry says he can judge the future by using his knowledge of the past, he continues on to give the ideal of the conduct of the British ministry for the last 10 years. Remember, at the very beginning of our talk here, we have a bunch of acts that have been passed, the Tax Acts, the Intolerable Acts, and he's using those as an appeal to logic, saying that these are not well received. Because they're not well received, he uses a bit of pathos, a bit of the emotions when he says, is it that insidious smile to which our petition has been lately received? That talks about the British fooling the colonists. So as he continues on and says, trust it not, sir, it'll prove a snare to your feet. Suffer not yourselves to be betrayed with a kiss. We have a metaphor here and a biblical allusion where Judas is betraying Jesus. Now, Henry is also going to employ a rhetorical question to make the colonists recognize that the British are prepping for war. He states, are fleets and armies necessary to a work of love and reconciliation? Have we shown ourselves so unwilling to be reconciled that force must be called in to win back our love? Remember, by the time he's giving his speech in March of 1775, it's been about a year since the Quartering Act has been passed, and there are now British soldiers on the land, and people are being forced to house them. So Patrick Henry continues. I ask, gentlemen, sir, what means this martial array, if its purpose be not to force us to submission? Can gentlemen assign any other possible motive for it? Has Great Britain any enemy in this quarter of the world to call for all this accumulation of navies and armies? No, sir, she has none. They are meant for us. They can be meant for no other. They are sent over to bind and rivet upon us those chains which the British ministry have been so long forging. And what have we to oppose to them? Shall we try argument? Sir, we have been trying that for the last 10 years. Have we anything new to offer upon the subject? Nothing. We have held the subject up in every light which it is capable, but it's been all in vain. Shall we resort to entreaty and humble supplication? What terms shall we find which have not been already exhausted? So look at all the questions we have here. Henry continues working through a lot of rhetorical questions that he follows by declarative sentences answering the questions for himself. Now he also uses parallel independent clauses with "they are meant for us, they can be meant for no other." Henry is also going to use a metaphor to those who bind and rivet those chains, creating an appeal to pathos. Now remember, he is speaking at the Virginia Convention in 1775. The men who are there, if they are not outright slave owners themselves, they know of slave owners. So using the sense of slavery to people who hold other in bondage would definitely create a pathos or emotions. So with all of these rhetorical questions, Henry is asking the audience, what can we use to go against the British? What is your argument to say that they're still here to help us? Is there anything we have not yet said that would make them reconcile? Shall we kiss up or flatter the king? And what promises should we try that we have not already been used? And so he continues on with all of his rhetorical questions, and he actually answers them because it's not expected for the audience to answer out loud. Let us not, I beseech you, sir, deceive ourselves. Sir, we have done everything that could be done to avert the storm which is now coming on. We have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have supplicated, we have prostrated ourselves before the throne and have implored its interposition to arrest the tyrannical hands of the ministry and parliament. Our petitions have been slighted. Our remonstrances have produced additional violence and insult. Our supplications have been disregarded, and we have been spurned with contempt from the foot of the throne. In vain, after these things, may we indulge the fond hope of peace and reconciliation. There is no longer any room for hope. So we have this parallel structure of we have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have supplicated, we have prostrated. And he continues on as he answers. Our petitions, our remonstrances. As he's using this parallel structure, this indicates that all actions are equally important, but they're also becoming more emphatic with the word choice. Now, his word choice is also inflammatory at the end. He's appealing again to emotions like additional violence and insult and being spurned or turned away like a lover. So all of the rhetorical structure here is showing the cause and effect. Look at all of the things that we have done already to try and tell Great Britain we want to be a part of their colonies. If we wish to be free, if we mean to preserve inviolate those inestimable privileges for which we've been so long contending, if we mean not basely to abandon the noble struggle in which we have been so long engaged, in which we have pledged ourselves never to abandon until the glorious object of our contest shall be obtained, we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left us. So we're making it towards the end of Patrick Henry's speech here, so he's going to have a call to action. Now, it's a long exclamatory sentence which state the results of the fighting, of this noble struggle that you're already into. And he creates a sense of urgency by using the exclamation point and the repetition of, we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. All of this at this point is an appeal to the emotions, an appeal to pathos. Henry is showing the desirable outcomes before he shows the undesirable way of attaining these goals, by fighting, which so many of the people listening want to avoid. Patrick Henry continues, They tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be the next week or the next year? Will it be when we are totally disarmed and when a British guard shall be stationed in every house? Shall we gather strength by irresolution and inaction? Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our backs and hugging the delusive phantom of hope until our enemies shall have bound us hand and foot? Sir, we are not weak if we make a proper use of those means which the God of nature hath placed in our power. 3 millions of people armed in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country as that which we possess, are invincible by any force which our enemy can send against us. Besides, sir, we shall not fight our battles alone. So he begins with the opposing argument that the colonists are weak, that you're unable to cope with so formidable an adversary such as the British Empire. But this area of the speech is also incorporating rhetorical questions and a statement that refutes them. Again, a lot of rhetorical questions. When shall we be stronger? Will it be next week? Will it be next year? Will it be when we're totally disarmed? Now, he also creates an appeal to your emotions, to pathos, through his description of the outcome of waiting. He also uses a metaphorical comparison here, where he talks about lying supinely on our backs and hugging the delusive phantom of hope, a very, very weak position. And again, the image of slavery is being extended, which creates an emotional pathos once again. Now, he refutes all of his rhetorical questions, appealing to the authority or the ethos, giving credit to their power from coming not from a king, but only from God. Patrick Henry continues on. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations, and who will raise up friends to fight our battles for us. The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. Besides, sir, we have no election. If we are base enough to desire it, it is now too late to retire from the contest. There is no retreat, but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged. The clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat, sir, let it come. Now again, we're starting off with uniting freedom with God's will and say that God is raising up allies. But we're also using pathos here with his last point of refutation that there's no choice because retreat would only result in slavery. Again, he's speaking to members of the Virginia Convention, higher class Virginians in 1775. So as this is yet another appeal to pathos, listeners can picture themselves in chains and being controlled by the British. And he uses sound imagery here. Our chains are forged, their clanking may be heard already on the plains of Boston. And so therefore he creates an urgent call to arms in his imperative exclamatory sentence of repetition. Let it come, I repeat it, sir, let it come. And finally, the last Patrick Henry speech. It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that the gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. So once again, we have a repetition of the opposing argument. When the others are speaking out peace, peace, we're creating an appeal to the emotions again when he says, no, the war has actually begun. He also metaphorically describes the advancement of the British military as a gale or a wind which will sweep through the north. Now, through the comparison, he's saying that just as a storm cannot be stopped by man, the British will not be stopped by man's human strength. Now, this also refers back to his point that only through God's power can the colonists win. He's also continuing on his appeal to emotional pathos with the continuation of the concept of slavery and all of his rhetorical questions. And then finally, Henry uses the antithesis, the either-or fallacy, to show that liberty is equally as valuable and desirable as death under the British rule, which would be destructive and very undesirable. Give me liberty or give me death. Thank you so much for stopping by for Patrick Henry's speech at the Virginia Convention. If you'd like to know more about Patrick Henry, or maybe perhaps you'd like me to go through some other things that are written by Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, and the other founding fathers, please leave a comment down below if you'd like to learn more. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed.